So my title today is Daddy Issues, and we've all got them. But it really is about looking at the concept of masculinity and fatherhood as it shows up in our world. Now, Joseph Campbell says, from your mother you get your body, from your father you get your role in the social world. And if we take that out of the traditional gender roles and just say from the feminine influences in your life and the masculine influences. And it may have been that you got that masculine influence from a woman in your life who taught you about the world. It was interesting, Joseph framed it this way, because when he was a boy growing up, his father was a traveling salesman and was gone most of the time, and his mother would take him on trips around the world in different, not around the world, but in different places in the world while his father was out on these several months long selling trips. So it was really, he got his view of the world and his experience of the world from his mother, but it's kind of a masculine energy to be the initiator, the one who brings the young person into awareness. And today in our culture, quite often, the father doesn't get quite the credit. If you can see the little girl's eyes and the way she's looking at her dad. Some of us, many of us, grew up in a time when you in the media, the father image was always very positively shown, or almost always. You know, father knows best, and Leave It to Beaver, and the Frank Capra movies and everything. The father was usually a very solid, very grounded person and everything, and that began to change. The pendulum began to swing the other way, and today it's pretty hard to find a really good father figure on TV or in the movies. They're there, but they're really the exception. You know, it's more like Family Guy kind of a situation, if you ever seen that. And this has an effect on it. It probably both reflects culture and it also influences culture. And in terms of today, the dad is usually shown as some kind of a doofus who hasn't quite figured things out, and mom has to be behind the scenes, keeping everything running, which was pretty true in my household as I grew up. I like to think it wasn't true in my adult life so much, but it probably was. So I want to talk about two qualities and two archetypes that show up early in life that are very heavily influenced by this masculine-feminine kind of juxtaposition, if you will. And the masculine energy needs to be present for the healthy development of these two archetypes. And this comes from the work of Carol Pearson, who it's from a book called Awakening the Heroes Within, and she was is a Joseph Campbell scholar, and she's now the provost at Pacifica. She's at Pacifica University up in Santa Barbara. But it talks about the innocent and the orphan, and the model here shows, and she talks about pairs of archetypes, and an archetype is simply a kind of a universal image or sense of self that all humans have. And she talks about different pairs of archetypes that show up at different parts of your life. And the first pair that shows up, really around the time of being a tiny child, an infant, are these two, the innocent and the orphan. So we're going to take a look at each of these and see how they can show up and how they affect us later in life. I was reading an interesting thing today. I don't remember if it was online or in the paper, but it was talking about, actually it was Reverend Bob Luckin who did our artwork on the side walls here, and he's kind of a poet and a writer, and he puts stuff up, but he talked about being a father, and he said, none of us get it right perfectly. We didn't know what the hell to do when the first child showed up. We either learned or we didn't, but the intention, he said, I'd never met anyone that didn't want to be a good father. So, and we were all raised by people that were both mothers and fathers, I think. Mothers tend to have a little more of a connection at that time, I think. There's a little more hard wiring about how to be a good mother that kind of often kicks in when that child shows up. The dads don't quite have that. There's usually that transformative moment when you see the child for the first time, but that doesn't lead to anything about knowing what to do. And we kind of have to figure that out. And some of us had it modeled very well for us, and some of us didn't. So that's kind of look from that context as we begin. So the innocent is the quality, the goal of the innocent. Each of these archetypes is sort of a psychological construct. It has a goal. The goal is to remain safe, and its greatest fear is abandonment. one of the first effects of a child in terms of its development psychologically is, am I safe in this environment? And it determines that by whether or not its needs are met. And its needs are pretty basic, to be fed and to be held and to be, taken care of and so forth, to have attention. And if that's denied, this abandonment issue can kick in pretty quickly. So the response to the dragon, in other words, how the archetype deals with challenge or difficulty, is to deny it or to seek rescue. And by the way, the innocent runs through our whole lives. Okay, but it tends to be developed pretty early on. So we develop these patterns in life about when we're challenged, when something goes wrong, do we tend to deny it or do we tend to seek rescue? And that's what the innocent tends to do. There's other archetypes that come in later that influence how we do that as well. The task of development is fidelity, or to be true, and discernment, to be able to determine, what to trust and what not to trust. The innocent basically trusts everything. You think of a little baby, it shows up, and it just fully expects to be completely accepted the way it is, right? It's like this little bundle of energy. And quite often parenting, after the first stages, especially when the child becomes mobile, is trying to contain this energy, right? Trying to, because as Robert Bly, the great poet, said, you show up full of enthusiasm for life and all your parents want is a nice kid. So there's that pressure to kind of contain that energy, and the innocent doesn't really understand what's going on with that. The gift of the innocent is trust, optimism, and loyalty. This is when the innocent is well developed in a healthy way. The child learns to trust, and the child learns optimism, to see that optimism is simply an expectation of a good future. And loyalty is that it's able to connect and bond with people. Carol Pearson says, the innocent in us trusts even when it's not warranted. The innocent believes it when a parent tells us that we are ugly, naughty, selfish, uncoordinated, stupid, or lazy. It is also the innocent who internalizes racism or sexism or homophobia or class bias, who believes that it is fundamentally not okay to be anything that others condemn. So this is that quality that we have to be heavily influenced by the opinions and actions of others. And it's also what picks up the temperament. It's not necessarily, we don't necessarily get what our parents want to teach us, but we definitely get their temperament in terms of how we interpret the world. So the journey of the innocent, as it develops, it begins in safety pretty much, although sometimes there can be trauma in utero and in the birth process, but let's say in a normal, healthy situation, it begins in safety, kind of a utopia. Suddenly you're thrown into a world of judgment and unfair discrimination. Okay? Where conflict and violence are rampant and illusions are shattered. Now, quite often, I was just talking to someone who's a young adult, and was in terms of in her classes at a university level course, was very, very upset when she learned that many of the things that we enjoy in this country, like technology and things, come at the expense of others in the world that are exploited. She never had quite understood that. And she was very, very upset. So that was kind of the activation of the innocent. It's the innocent that loses that sense of innocence when you find out that the world isn't quite what you expected it to be, or it's not the perfection that you want it to be. So that can stay well into adulthood, actually all the way through adulthood. The desire is to return to innocence, which is difficult if not impossible. The innocent wants to go back to the way it was, wants to go to safety. Okay. She says, since innocents, at least initially, are absolutist and dualistic, they cannot admit they are imperfect without feeling horrible about themselves. So they either get locked into denial about their own inadequacies or are controlled by guilt and shame. So this is quite often a dynamic in father-daughter relationships. In terms of, and it can be father-son too, certainly, but in terms of the trying to live up to the expectations of the father. not wanting to disappoint the father, or again, it could be the mother, or some significant figure in life, like not wanting to disappoint a teacher or a mentor. And when you do, when you don't necessarily live up to the standards that are expected, you tend to feel horrible about yourself and feel diminished. So that's what she's talking about here. So the shadow of each of these archetypes has a shadow side and a light side. The shadow side, the way it shows up, healthy innocents forgive themselves and moderate their behavior when they transgress. The shadow side has real trouble with forgiveness, especially of self. Okay. Innocents in fear avoid facing fear by blaming themselves. Why should and you can be the one who is being victimized, but you're afraid to speak out, so you say, well, it's probably my fault anyway. This often happens in abusive relationships, where the person being abused doesn't speak out, doesn't stand in their strength. It feels easier to blame themselves. That's the shadow side of the innocent. Believe it is important to be defined by one's social role and not have secrets from the world. So you'll hear people say, well, I'm only, used to be in the old days, I'm only a carpenter's daughter, or my family I'm not a college graduate. I remember when I first started as a police officer back in Ocean City, Maryland in the 70s, all the summer cops, which I was, were either college students or college graduates, and every single one of the year-round policemen, none of them had gone to college. And there were like 35 year-round policemen and 150 summer cops. So what you got all the time was, hey, college boy, go over and handle that situation, And that's a projection of a sense of inadequacy, you see? Because they were very conscious of that kind of social distinction and didn't quite know how to deal with it, so they tried to put you in situations, if you were the college boy, that you couldn't handle, so they could feel better about themselves. There'd be like some 6'8" drunk going crazy in a bar, and they'd send one college boy in, and then you'd have to go and rescue him, and you say, see, college boy, you can't do everything. That was kind of what happened, and I was the college boy as often as not in that situation, laying there, hanging onto the guy's ankle. Okay. Innocents who often feel special can be charismatic because of the purity of their beliefs and vision. They also assume that they will be cared for by the universe and other people because they are so special and so good. Kind of an interesting way that can show up. Quite often you'll see children that are all, very much told, you are perfect, you are great, you are wonderful, and they feel that. They feel like they go into a situation, and they when the challenges show up, they look around for, isn't anybody going to rescue me? And they're very surprised in those cases where someone doesn't. That can be a loss of innocence as well. So let's look at the orphan. And the orphan, according to Carol Pearson, shows up a little bit later, maybe later in the first year of life. And the orphan has some interesting characteristics. Again, a light side and a dark side. The goal of the orphan is to regain safety, because by this point, there's been some challenges, some difficulties. The child has had to cry a lot. In almost any situation. The food isn't on time, or they got colic, or something's going on. So they're learning that life isn't quite as bucolic as it was in the womb there. The fear of the orphan is exploitation and victimization. Okay. The response to the dragon or to a problem is powerlessness, wish for rescue, or cynical compliance. Anyone ever see anyone comply cynically with like government regulations or stuff like that? That can be the orphan expressing. The task of the orphan is to process pain and disillusionment fully and be open to receive help from others. So this is the element within you that learns to deal with disappointment, with pain in a healthy way, ideally, and learns to ask for help. Okay, which many people find very difficult to do. You know, I should be able to take care of this myself. And if you're a man in our culture, you're supposed to have everything under control all the time. And if you're a woman, you may be more comfortable with asking for help, but you may not feel safe in doing so. So it's kind of an interesting dynamic. And that's the orphan archetype being active. The gift of the orphan is interdependence, empathy, and realism. Being able to be in a team or a family in an effective way. Empathy, to kind of feel and understand what other people are feeling emotionally. And realism is to have kind of a realistic view that, you know, everybody isn't perfect and everybody isn't imperfect. It's a mixture. We're all a mixture. The world isn't black or white, it's shades of gray. The orphan experiences the same fall as the innocent, but to a different effect, she says. The orphan sees it as demonstrating the essential truth that we are all on our own. One of the essential ideas of the orphan is I'm in this by myself. Which in ways we are. To the degree that we do not acknowledge that the orphan inside us, that orphan is abandoned by us as well as the world. Okay. So the orphan, our society does not accept being hurt or vulnerable as a rule, right? So we hide our vulnerable, lost, hurt inner child. The whole idea of inner child work, which is that when you experience trauma as a child, that gets internalized in such a way that it's sort of like we all have various versions of ourselves as children still existing, and when something's triggered relating to that, that's what reacts or responds, that wounded inner child. We all try to hide our vulnerability. And we do that for fear of being judged, you know, or evaluated or held back or missing out as a judged by others who are ironically also hiding their own woundedness. This is particularly true in adolescence, right? We're terrified of being judged. You know, I learned when I had daughters of that age that, you know, sometimes in church we'd have people stand up and say hello and, you know, who are you? And if you're in this group, never do that to a middle schooler. You know, because they're like, they just want to kind of fade into the background if they're not around the people they really trust. Because they're going through that phase of discovering themselves and being pretty harshly judged by the people around them. You know, that age, adolescence, early adolescence into teen years can be pretty harsh emotionally. Of course, that all goes away in your 20s, right? The result is a lonely, wounded inner child when you have these kinds of fears that are actualized and when you find yourself in a fairly harsh environment. This is another place where the protective idea of the healthy masculine energy can be of great help and reassurance. You know, letting kids know in advance that the judgment of others is not what's important, it's how you feel about yourself. But again, if what's been modeled for you as a parent has been being judged, you'll tend to be judgmental of your own kids, and they'll grow up, you know, having learned that pretty reliably. So the making of an orphan, life is full of orphaning experiences, and an orphaning experience is when, not just when someone goes away, but when some basic idea about yourself becomes invalid. It goes away or appears to go away. And certainly life is all about loss, right? I mean, we lose things all the way through life. We lose people, we lose jobs, we move out of houses that we may have been attached to. I know I've had some difficult parting experiences with some of the cars I've owned. And things like that because, you know, and we have to learn to mourn. The healthy orphan has to learn how to mourn loss. And quite often we don't do that very well. The orphan is activated by painful experiences, okay, especially childhood ones. So we're often activated in adulthood when we feel that something is very relational to something that happened to us as a child that was traumatic. Okay, oh, you're going to leave me too. You know, no, hold on for a minute. We are wounded people raised by wounded parents. And we just have to recognize that no matter how well you were parented, we're all a little wounded. I mean, some of us are more than others. So it's not a matter of are you wounded or not. It's how wounded have you been? And have you learned ways to help heal that wounding in a way that you're able to be effective in the world? Whether our parents have acknowledged their own wounding and begun to heal is really important. Have we seen examples, or has it been modeled for us how to overcome some of those woundedness issues in a healthy way, or even to admit them? I know in my house you didn't admit, when I was growing up, you didn't admit that you needed healing. You dealt with it. And if you were a boy, you were taught to be tough. And if you were a girl, you were taught to go in your room and cry. Don't cry in front of other people. Because you know how girls are. They're going to cry. That was kind of my dad's attitude and my uncle's attitude, and all the cousins kind of, that was a very similar kind of an energy field, I guess, in white suburban Baltimore, that I probably is different than other places and other demographics and things like that. But we all have this kind of experience growing up of how it's dealt with. How did our caregivers model dealing with the pain of life? And was it dealt with? Or was it hidden? Or, I remember one time we had been to Washington, D.C. to go to the Smithsonian and stuff, and it was my grandparents and my parents and me. And we got back, and something had been going. We picked up my grandfather's sister who lived in Washington, and went around to the museums, and something was going on between her and my dad. And she invited us into her apartment to have, refreshments or something afterward. No, we need to get back home. And this pissed off my grandfather. So there was a lot of silence in the car, the hour and a half or so it took to drive back to Baltimore. And I remember when when my grandfather got out of the car, he said something to my dad, and my dad got out of the car, and they're in a shouting match on the front yard of my grandfather's house for about 5 minutes, and then I said, "What's going on?" My mom says, "Just sit there." And he gets back in the car, and I remember he said, "That son of a bitch." And my mother said, "That's enough." And not another word was said. That was pretty typical, There'd be all this simmering, and all of a sudden a little explosion, and then we'll never speak of this again, And the next time we all got together, it was a little tension, and then it melted away. But that's how we dealt with. That's how you deal with things in the world I grew up in. And don't let the children hear. Of course, we heard everything. We were sneaking around listening. But, it was that kind of a thing. So, think about what was, and you may have had a very different experience growing. You may have been a much more expressive family where everybody let everything out. But just think about the energy growing up and how it affected you as a child and how it affects you now in terms of how you deal with these kinds of issues in your own life, with your own children, or just with the people that you associate with. It's kind of interesting. She says, we are all then on a continuum. Some of us come from pretty good families, and some come from just awful families, and the rest from every kind in between. The child in each of us has been orphaned somewhere. It's simply part of growing up. In short, we discover that life is not always fair, authorities are not always right, and there are no infallible absolutes. And that's really part of growing up, isn't it? The thing is not to get buried, as it talked about earlier, not to get buried in the cynicism, where you project that everything is screwed up all the time and nothing can be trusted, because that just makes you unhappy. You know what? Even if it's true, it just makes you unhappy. And the truth is, there are times when people can be trusted. There are government officials that actually do a good job, that make good decisions. It does happen once in a while, even when your party's not in power. And so forth. But if we fall into this wounded orphan, we just won't trust anything or anyone. And it feels very safe, and it's also it's kind of lazy, Because remember it talked about the gift was of the innocent is discernment, to learn to discern what is right and what isn't right. If I say nothing's right, I don't have to use my discernment or develop it. That's really a lazy way of living, which many people tend to fall into, at least in some areas of their life. You know, oh, it's you speaking, I don't have to listen, because I know whatever you say is going to be a lie. You know, so you don't stand a chance with me. So the making of an orphan. The orphan is the disappointed idealist, the disillusioned innocent. Okay, we probably got some of that in us, right? The orphan knows that the wicked often prosper. And she talks about here the idea of orphan to exile to rebel. The orphan often feels like an exile. Okay. And when we give up the childlike wish for paradise, we begin to grow up. So the rebel stage is often the way of acting out to try to fix everything or to differentiate yourself enough from that which cannot be trusted. The trouble is if you stay in rebel your whole life, then you end up just looking for things to rebel against. And you'll rebel against anything that's handy. You know, if you'll notice over the years when there's been issues, the same people always show up to protest the issue. They're professional rebels. Right? It's not that they're necessarily tied to that issue. It's, oh, there's an issue. I'm a rebel. I guess I better go. You know, it's kind of like if you over-identify as a warrior, every time there's a war, you're going to show up. Or if there's none handy, you'll start one. Because you've got to fulfill your role. If you're a problem solver, you need problems. Right? So it's how we identify that often causes us to show up that way. When we give up the childlike wish for paradise, we begin to grow up. Now, this is very much what Jung talks about. What he calls individuation is the development of the mature adult. That usually, he says, doesn't occur until middle age or later. He talks about childhood, adolescence, first adulthood, middle age, and second adulthood. And middle age is the place where you realize that trying to live out your childhood fantasies in the first adulthood didn't work. And if you do this in a healthy way, you have what he calls a midlife course correction. If you don't and you're not aware, you have a midlife crisis. Because it's all these inner archetypes saying, okay, enough is enough. We can't keep going on like this. So a lot of times, you know, you'll see people grow beards and stuff in midlife, and it's you know, well, it's either this or a red sports car. So, and I admit I'm past midlife. So, this is a second adulthood beard. Okay, the shadow of the orphan is to be shallow and a bit neurotic. Now, neuroses is the best definition I ever heard of neuroses is the avoidance of legitimate pain. That we're neurotic when there's something we don't want to confront about ourselves or about our relationships or whatever, so we become neurotic, which becomes ineffectual at dealing with it and tends to perpetuate it. To live in a scarcity mentality can be the unhealthy element of the orphan. I don't have this, I don't have that. Can be very susceptible to advertising or to influence by others. People in the unhealthy orphan, you know, they're the ones that when you go to the big motivational speeches down at the Staples Center, they're in the back lining up for the Mega Gold package that's only available for 15 minutes at $35,000 because they're going to turn their life around. Okay, very susceptible to that kind of thing. Very susceptible to someone with a story. So when a sociopath meets someone in their orphan shadow, you have a marriage made in heaven. Because the sociopath will tend to take advantage of them. And that's exactly what the person in the orphan shadow needs at that moment in order to have a chance to wake up and heal. Sometimes we lead ourselves on destructive pathways so that we will wake up and heal. Can be desperate to please. If you're a people pleaser, it's an orphan issue. Okay? The only one you should be pleasing is your spiritual leader. Can be very image conscious. So that would make you think there's a lot of orphan issues in Los Angeles, right? Not in Simi Valley. Just fear of introspection. Afraid to look inside because you know what you're going to find isn't going to be very pleasant. What you're going to find is a need for a lot of correction, a need for a lot of change. So quite often the person that's stuck in this orphan shadow will resist putting themselves in situations where they'll need to look inside. Can be stuck in victimization and pain as well. So once again, this quote by Joseph, from your mother you get your body, from your father you get your role in the social world. From those influences, the masculine influence has a lot to do with how the innocent and the orphan evolve. And it can be in either parent or both parents, or just if you're raised by a single parent. The way that energy is expressed in terms of conveying to you acceptance, love, that you are a powerful being, that you're going, but that helps you develop a realistic view of the world, that the world isn't always going to go your way, that there are going to be challenges, there are going to be people that can't be trusted, and that we grow up in a way that allows us to interact with the world in a healthy way. So the picture of the ideal father becomes more like this. So, if it's in your capacity to have a happy Father's Day, have a happy Father's Day. If this is a day when you mourn the loss of someone, mourn the loss of someone. If this is the day when you deal with anger and frustration, then deal with that today. Have your version of Father's Day, and it's just perfect, however it needs to be. Thank you, and namaste.